I want to cover two more topics from chapter 20 that are pretty simple. I have provided some links and files on the Canvas page to help give some more information on these. And then I want to go over the study guide for exam one and show you that we've covered all these topics and show you what we haven't covered specifically. But all the topics are covered, just the wording is a little funny. Anyway, so let's go ahead real quick, and I want to cover chapter 20 about a topic called horizontal gene transfer, or sometimes it's called interspecies gene transfer. I provided a link for you that is from the National Institutes of Health. It's a professionally science published paper here. Anyway, it's a paper about horizontal gene transfer and how this is important in the evolution of animals. Now, horizontal gene transfer is a topic that mostly was talked about in microbiology or referring to bacteria. And bacteria have a number of different ways they can transfer genetic material to each other. This was first discovered when bacteria generated antibiotic resistance by transforming or acquiring DNA from another bacterium that had resistance genes. But since then, other methods of gene transfer, conjugation, where bacteria or cells will transfer genetic material between the two, or transduction, where a virus will transfer genes to the genome, called a lysogenic viral cycle. Viruses can also facilitate gene transfer. Anyway, you can read all about that in this introduction and abstract. Anyway, this paper has a good summary of horizontal gene transfer and as it relates to the evolution of animals. This diagram here in the paper is very similar to one in your book. And this proposes that in the history of life, remember from our timeline that I proposed for eukaryote or protista evolution in the protista lab, that from about 3 billion years ago, sorry, 3.5 billion years ago to 2 billion years ago, prokaryote cells, eubacteria and archaea type cells, were the only types of life present. And then about 2 billion years ago, eukaryotes arose on the scene, and these would be cells that have internally membrane-bound nuclei and mitochondria, among other things. The proposal, called the endosynthesis theory of eukaryotic evolution, is that there has been a series of intergene transfer events that have occurred between bacteria and archaea to initially produce the lineage of eukaryotes. And then since eukaryotes have evolved, there have been further transfers into the eukaryote lineage. So this is what's called horizontal gene transfer, where you have a transfer between two different cells of genome material. Sometimes it's called interspecies gene transfer when we're referring to phyletic transfer. Let's say, for example, you have bacteria transferred from a bacterium in the gut of an insect, like a termite, and that bacterium or protist then transfers nuclear material to the actual cells of the termite. And this has been documented. So this paper will give you some background on horizontal gene transfer or interspecies gene transfer and how it relates to animals. Okay, so I will be giving you some additional questions on the exam. And these are written questions. These are not questions related to multiple choice. One of them will be related to interspecies gene transfer or horizontal gene transfer. You have enough information in the papers that I've listed for you to answer these questions. Also, you could do some outside research. The final topic I want to mention here is on phylogenetics. And phylogenetics, we've talked about this with the communicules lab. I know some of you got a lot out of the communicules lab and understood it. Some of you just kind of barely bumped through the communicules lab and didn't know what was going on. But the information that you have from the communicules lab will be on this first lecture exam. I'm not going to put it on the lab exam. Anyway, the topic that I want to refer to on this is phylogenetics and the importance of phylogenetics. This is in chapter 20 as well. I have this page from UC Berkeley's evolution department website. Let me go ahead and get it full in here. I put a link to this site on the Canvas page, and I'll show you that. This is Understanding Evolution from UC Berkeley's Museum of Paleontology, and phylogenetic systematics and evolutionary trees. You really kind of have to understand why phylogenetics is important. The last topic that we had on macroevolution was evidence for evolution, and homology is really the key for understanding relationship among organisms. And using homology to build hypothetical evolutionary trees is what phylogenetics is. Phylogenetics is basically estimating the evolutionary history of species using trees. So there are a number of links here. How to read an evolutionary tree. We've talked about this basically with the communicules lab. So you can go ahead. I'm not taking any surveys here. So you can go ahead and review that. How to classify organisms based on evolutionary trees. This is really interesting. You know, I mentioned this before, that one of the applications that we're going to see later in the semester is the evolution and classification of reptiles and birds. And I'm going to let you go ahead and review this. But using trees to classify organisms and then estimate their evolutionary history, it really depends on the type of data you're using. If you're using a phonetic classification, you're going to use overall similarities. And as a result, you would have, for example, crocodilians and reptiles like lizards and snakes and turtles classified together. But if you're using a cladistic classification, in cladistics, you're using only shared derived characters. You would have crocodiles or crocodilians classified mostly aligned with the birds, separate from the lizards and snakes and turtles. And so that has to do with essentially the types of data you're using. So I'm going to let you review this, and you can understand the difference between, I don't want to take a survey, between cladistics and phonetics. So you're responsible for understanding the difference between cladistic classification and phonetic classification. Okay, I'll get out of here before it makes me take a survey. All right, here's a image of your class Canvas page. I want to point out where all this content will be. You have Zoology Lecture Exam 1 content, and there is our first lectures on Chapter 1. We have our next lectures on Chapter 18, 19, and 20. I will add a Zool lecture video 5.1 when this is finished. I have some species concept and polyploidy articles here related to last week's chapter. And then I have the links for phylogenetics, horizontal gene transfer, and gene transfer in animals for today's lecture. Then there is this link here for the Zoology Exam 1 study guide. And I'm sure a lot of you have looked at this page. I want to open this page up now and take a look. Okay, so here is the Exam 1 study guide. And what this is basically is a list of questions that relate to Exam 1 as we have covered them. Okay, and what I want to do is demonstrate that we have covered every topic on this list. There is some wording on here that is different from how I normally do it in a face-to-face class, and I want to point those out so that you don't freak out and message me that you don't understand something. I want to convince you that we actually have it in our summary here. I've simplified it for our distance zoology for fall 2020. Okay, what is required for all scientific inquiry? Basically, this is chapter 1. We covered what is science and how is zoology a science. That had to do with the giraffe hypotheses. So you're responsible in chapter 1 for understanding science and how zoology is a science and what makes a good scientific hypothesis and etc. So I covered that in those videos, and so you can look at that in chapter 1 and review that information. Then we jump to chapter 18 and talk about the history of evolution. I talked about Lamarck and why Lamarck was important. You will be asked questions about Lamarck and maybe identifying what maybe a Lamarck style hypothesis for evolution would be. Pretty straightforward. Acquired traits was Lamarck's main theory. Although it wasn't demonstrated, it was the first testable mechanism for evolution before Darwin. Then we had a series of Darwin questions. This is beyond the book. I gave you a link of Darwin's travels and some information about Darwin as well as lecture. And so all of this is essentially stop by stop of Darwin's voyage of the Beagle. I'm trying to get that there. Anyway, so all the way up to the volcanic islands. So here's the deal. What were the 5 parts of Darwin's theory of evolution? I did present those in a PowerPoint, so you're good to go for that. And which parts of Darwin's theory were most controversial? We have covered that. That was the gradualism versus and natural selection is his controversial theories. Okay, so the part that might confuse you here is I have written here, what are the 5 observations and 3 inferences that describe natural selection? Don't worry about the 5 and the 3. You need to know what natural selection is. You don't need to explain the observations and inferences. This was an essay question that I had on the lecture exam face-to-face. We're not going to have that as an essay question for this test. Certainly, you have to know the 3 types of natural selection. That was directional, stabilizing, and diversifying. Okay, so survival of the fittest versus what Darwin really said. You should know that Darwin did not say survival of the fittest. That was Herbert Spencer. Not a good explanation for evolution, even though our book says that, which is kind of surprising. All right, you should know microevolution versus macroevolution, the mechanisms that contribute to microevolution, natural selection, and there were a number of other mechanisms, sexual selection, genetic drift, and mutation. We had some idea of the duration that's required, what's required for microevolution to be converted into macroevolution. Allopatric speciation is our primary mechanism for speciation that we discussed, and so I had pre-mating and post-mating isolating mechanisms, and so you can go ahead and review these. There certainly will be some scenarios that you will have to describe as being a pre-mating or post-mating mechanism. Here's one question that we didn't get a chance to cover. So question 28, what is a ring species? I'm not going to ask you this question on the exam. If you're interested, go ahead and look it up, but we didn't have time to get into a ring species. Okay, on to species concept definitions. We had the Linnaeus concept, the Darwin concept. Those were the nominal and typological species. Then there was the most widely accepted concept by Ernst Mayr, which was the biological species concept. So you should be able to describe or identify scenarios where the biological species concept is at play. If a natural population produces fertile offspring, they are considered the same species. If they produce hybrids that are sterile or don't reproduce at all, they're separate species. It's real simple. Okay, there's some problems with the biological species concept, and you should be able to maybe identify some of those. Then we have evolutionary species concept and genetic species concept. I'll certainly be asking you some questions about these, even though they're not really identified in the textbook. They might be a written question, hint, hint, but I've given you enough information to answer these questions. Finally, we're looking at examples of speciation that can happen instantaneously. Sympatric species are done by what's called polyploidy, and we have allopolyploidy and autopolyploidy as our examples. You should know the difference between these two topics. The group of organisms where polyploidy is most evident is in the plants. Finally, homology is an important evidence for macroevolution, and this leads to using homology as a way to identify phylogenetics or phylogeny of organisms. And so you should understand how homology is used and what that means versus analogous traits. Analogous traits are convergent evolution, and they can sometimes confuse phylogeny. Finally, we just covered this today, compare and contrast holistic versus phonetic classification, but you had a lab on that for lab 1 with the communicables, so it's not unfamiliar. Okay, so hopefully I've demonstrated that we've covered pretty much every topic in the study guide list, and the only topic that I'm not going to test you on is the ring species, but it's basically an example of allopatric speciation. If you have any questions about lecture exam 1, I'll put a discussion on that that you can contribute to and read up to the exam time. And so the exam is going to be 1 hour multiple choice. I recommend that you take the 1 hour multiple choice first. In fact, I'm going to see if I can't make it such that you have to take it first. So it's a 1 hour multiple choice test. There'll be about 50 to 60 questions on that 1 hour multiple choice test. I haven't decided yet. So 50 or 60 questions. Basically, there's not enough time to go look up the answer for all the questions. Obviously, you're at home, you have your computer, you have the internet, you have your textbook. Obviously, you'll have access to resources to look up. It's kind of like a take-home exam. You can look up background on questions, try to help you select the right answer. But warning, you do not have enough time to look up every question. So a good strategy to do on these types of exams is to go through the test, answer all the questions that you know the answer to or you're confident with right away, and then go back through and prioritize questions that you need to look up the answer. If you make it halfway through the test and time's up, too bad. You knew that this was a timed exam, that you didn't have time to go look up all the answers. And that's just the nature of the beast here. Okay, so you'll take your exam, your multiple choice test for 1 hour, 50 to 60 questions. I haven't decided how mean to be yet. Then there will be 3 written questions posted. And these are short essay questions. These 3 short essay questions, there'll be 3 questions. You have to write them up as a long paragraph. So kind of a long paragraph type scenario. You can include diagrams or pictures. Just be sure that if you're including content that is not your own original work, like if your diagram is not something you drew, if you're copying it from the internet, you need to provide an appropriate reference to that. And if you need to use a certain reference material, let's go ahead and use APA. If you want to use APA citation, American Psychological Association citation, that's probably the easiest to use with references. But I want to emphasize that even though you have access to the computer and Google and online resources, I'm going to be really a stickler on plagiarism. I do not want you to just simply copy content from Wikipedia. And many of you know that the Shasta College can use the program called Turnitin. If I suspect you have copy and pasted content, I'm going to run your exam answer against Turnitin and see what pops up. But what I want here is your interpretation of the information out there. So if you have used some resource that you're borrowing to present, you need to cite that resource. These are 3 questions. You need to turn these in all together as one file. I don't want to see a bunch of files being turned into the Dropbox. Put it as one file. You can assemble these in Microsoft Word or some type of sort of Word document, and it's best if you turn them in as a PDF. The Microsoft Word, when you print, you can print to PDF. That's a page document format, and that PDF is good because what you see in a PDF is exactly what I see, and then we don't end up with widows and orphans and images that don't come through. So turn it in as PDF, turn it in as one document. There's 3 questions, and you've all done written assignments. You're going to answer them in sequence. You have over 3 hours, or basically 3 hours, to research these 3 questions. It really should take you 20 minutes each. So I'm giving you way more time than you need for the 3 questions, and those will be due at the end of the 4-hour time block. So if you're taking the test from 9 to 1, those 3 questions are due by 1 o'clock. If you've made an alternative test time, the 3 questions are due within 4 hours. Okay, so it all depends on what you see on your Canvas calendar. All right, I'll put a discussion for lecture exam 1 if you have any questions, but this is a big experiment. I'm kind of going easy on you for this test to see how it goes, and we will see you at the exam.